Hello, everybody. This is one of my personal games played earlier this week on the 1st of February. This video is going to be about how you can plan in chess, how to adapt your plans and rely on themes of the opening, middle game, and end game, and whether you need to calculate or you can just fall back on ideas you've encountered previously. The game I'm about to show you was played in the North Circular League, Barnet against Wanstead, two giants of international chess. But I was playing for Barnet. I was black, and I was playing Mark Murrell, who was white, rating of 153 ECF. So not a bad player. Probably about 1800 FIDE if you converted. I'm not quite sure of the exact conversion rate. Anyway, so this game was played with 80 minutes, and you had 10 seconds increment. And very briefly, for those of you who don't know, the increment system is where every time you make a move and hit the clock, you gain an additional few seconds. So this was with 10 seconds added on for every time you made a move, and it goes all the way through to the end of the game. So hypothetically, a game could go on forever. Fortunately, this one didn't, though. So Mark played d4, I played knight f6, and bishop g5 was played. Now, I must confess, I don't know this line very well. I know it's called the Trompovsky. Usually what white is planning to do is put a question to black very early. So black really has three options. The first is to kick the bishop with h6 and try and put the question to white. Is white happy to take off the bishop for the knight and leave black with doubled pawns, or will white retreat? Second option usually is to play e6, going into a pin voluntarily, but if white captures, you can keep your pawn structure intact with queen takes knight. The third option, which I chose, was knight e4, and now black is attacking the bishop, so Mark played bishop f4, and here I chose to play d5. So at this point I felt fairly okay with the position. I've got the e4 square under control. I've got a knight in white's half of the board. And here the rather unusual move f3 was played. And here all my opening knowledge just sort of went out the window. I don't really know this position very well, but I can get a few ideas from it. After I move the knight, what white will be planning to do will be to break with e4. So that's why f3 might not be such a bad move. On the downside for white, the knight on g1 might have a hard time moving. So with this in mind, I thought the best move was knight f6, and then to just try and keep control of e4 with a move like bishop f5, for example. On reflection, though, it might be better to play knight d6 and then play f5, just to go into a kind of Stonewall Dutch and keep e4 under control, stop white breaking. But you know, I'm sure this is an okay way of playing. White played c4, going into a kind of Queen's Gambit opening, and I didn't take because I just thought if I did, e4 might be very strong for white. The c4 pawn is probably not something I can hold on to for very long, and white's supported centre might be very tricky to play against. And here, I was still a bit caught up in my my original plan of bishop f5. So instead of playing e6, I played c6, going into a Slav type position here. But again, on reflection, I think the best move would have not been to panic, would just have been to play knight c6, developing a piece. And I'm not worried about the e4 lunge here, because after c takes, I can play knight takes, and now white's position is very, very tricky, because if the bishop moves somewhere, I might have enough time to play f5 if I want, or I can just do a move like bishop d7 or e6 or g6. And e4 might not be so good because I could target the d4 pawn. If the bishop were to move to, say, g3, I would have knight e3, which could be very annoying. And the bishop doesn't really have a lot of places to go. Bishop g5, I could play h6. And again, if it moved to h4, I have knight e3. So the best move might be to undevelop, if that isn't a word it should be, undevelop his bishop to c1. And then I'll have two knights out, and he'll just have pawns that have moved, so I'll be ahead in development. Anyway, this is probably a better plan, but I was quite tired, and I was just trying to operate off momentum and go off plans I already kind of knew. So I know the idea of the Slav, and so I played c6 to kind of go into a similar looking position. Here knight c3 was played, attacking d5, and I just continue regardless of what white's played with bishop f5 here. And I think this is not such a good move, maybe not because of what the computer says, but because the position that results isn't one I'm very comfortable playing. And in chess, even though the position may be equal or okay for one side, if you're not comfortable playing it and you don't really know what the plan is, what to do, how to handle a position, it may as well be bad for you because you're not going to use the position very well, and you might quite easily slip into a lost position. So I probably should have just bit my tongue and played e6 here. So again, my bishop would be not great, but I would have a more comfortable position. I'd put my bishop on e7, I'd maybe play b6 and bishop a6, and castle kingside. And that kind of position is one that I can play quite well. But again, bishop f5 to put the bishop outside the pawn chain. My idea is to play e6 next move. And then queen b3 was played. So as somebody else on YouTube has called it, I won't take the credit for making up this term. The weakness of my last move has been that the bishop on c8 was guarding b7, and now it's not anymore. So he's attacking an undefended pawn, and now black has three attackers on d5 to worry about, and there's only three defenders, sorry. So I can't play queen c8 or a move like that to defend the pawn. b6 doesn't look very strong because white could take on d5, and then bishop b5 check could be very annoying coming up. And can anyone see why queen d7 isn't a very good move here? It's quite a tactical line. Alright, it's quite tricky. I'll give you another 10 seconds, but if I mention that the queen and the king are now on the same line, or on the same diagonal, that can potentially cause problems. Bear that in mind. I'll give you another 10 seconds to look at the position. Why is queen d7 not good? Yeah, White can play c takes d5, knight takes d5 or pawn takes, knight takes, and if queen takes d5, then white has queen takes b7, just winning the house at this point. So pawn takes, and then white can play e4, attacking the bishop, and if you want to keep that bishop, maybe take, but then there's a devastating move of bishop takes b8, and if I recapture, then bishop b5, again winning the house. I'm just going to lose a queen for a piece and maybe a pawn. So this is resignable. Even by my standards, I wouldn't play on in this position. So I did see that, fortunately. I wasn't too tired not to calculate lines. Now, with that in mind, b6 isn't very strong, but it may be the best of the bad options. Queen d7 is practically unplayable. And I think d takes c4 might not be very good for similar reasons to why white played queen b3. So what would you play as black in this position? Well, excellent, excellent. If you found what the move I played was, then great. I played queen b6. Now, I've spoken in a few videos about how I hate to have a bad pawn structure, and I often count the pawn structure as being more important than some other players do. I think pawn structure is very important to the nature of the position. So it does look strange if I play this, because white could take queens, and after I recapture, he could then give me doubled isolated pawns by taking on d5. And then after I recapture, I'm going to have two pawns on b7 and b6 that won't have any friends on on the a file or the c file. But this is a sort of thematic position of the Slav, as I'm about to show you in the game. What black can do is when there's double pawns, there's always an open or semi-open file that goes along with it. So black's rooks can become very active on the A and C files and can try and take control of the queen side. So that's the double-edged nature of the doubled isolated pawns. White doesn't capture immediately, though. White plays e3, just defending d4, which my queen was potentially attacking, although I don't think I would have taken it due to queen takes b7. But it also just shores up white's position. It allows knight e2 or bishop on f1 to move. So it's not a bad move. It's just maybe a little bit passive. I now play what I was planning on doing for a while, e6, letting my bishop out. And now white did take. But the last move has given me the option of if white takes on d5, then I can take with the e pawn, and I won't have doubled isolated pawns anymore, and I'll have the open A and E files to concentrate on. Instead, though, as you've just seen, white kicks my bishop a little, and then Mark decided to try and threaten to win my bishop. So h4, and h6 is probably the best move. It's quite sort of it doesn't gain much space or anything, but it's solid. It keeps the pawn structure pretty much intact, and it gives a bolt hold for my bishop. But instead, I chose an idea which I've seen played before. I'm not sure how good it is here, but it does give me a bit more space to work with. I played h5, and after h5, Mark played a move I was not expecting at all. He played bishop takes knight, and I think the idea is to get my rook off the a file temporarily, so I won't be able to castle queenside if I wanted to, and my rook will have to move twice in the game just to get onto a square it was originally. But I don't reckon this move because I feel that his bishop was better than my knight, so he's lost quality, not quantity in terms of material. And I instead, as white, would have played g5 because my knight's now given a choice. Either I can move it to d7, which I was planning on doing, but if I do that, where's my other knight moving to? Again, quality of the pieces. The knight on b8 now is sort of stuck in terms of where it can go to. It can move. I mean, it can go to a6, but if white were to simply play a3 at some point, the knight would then practically be out of moves apart from where it's been already. So I would like white's position here. Instead, though, after bishop takes and rook takes, he then played g5. So now knight d7 solved the problem of my cramped pieces, and this goes to an again a sort of thematic principle, shall we call it? It isn't universal; it doesn't apply to every position, but it does. It's good to have as a general rule and to remember this. If you have a space advantage, then try and avoid unnecessary exchanges because your opponent is going to have less space than you, and therefore their pieces are generally quite cramped, and they're all tripping up over each other, trying to find something to do and somewhere to be. But the fewer pieces are on the board, the less it matters about the space advantage in a way, because with fewer pieces, they're generally going to not collide and interfere with each other, and will instead coordinate far more effectively. So again, that's why I don't like bishop takes b8. So after g5 knight d7, c takes was played, and here I felt that even though it's a thematic idea to take with the c pawn and have the c and a files available to the rooks, I felt that I didn't really need to wreck my pawn structure, and I felt that the compensation wasn't enough. So I took with the e pawn, and now white uses the diagonal. It's just been vacated by my pawn and plays bishop h3. So this is quite a good move. I hadn't seen it at all. Maybe due to tiredness, maybe because it's not a very commonly seen move. But where else was the bishop going to go? It can't go to anywhere on the diagonal f1 to a6. It can't go to a6, b5, c4, d3, and e2 doesn't really seem to do very much, and it could even interfere with his g knight. It might want to go to e2, and g2, which is the classic kind of fianchetto, doesn't really do much because I've got a solid brick wall of a pawn chain on b7, c6, d5. So h3, you having a mobile bishop is the best square for it. So good move by Mark. Now I chose to develop my bishop finally after 15 moves and play bishop d6. King f2 was now played, partly due to the fact that with the queens off and there being not a lot of danger for this king, the centre's quite closed, it's not open. Why do you need to castle? have a central king, and maybe in the end game, or late middle game, the king could be used actively. So after that, I chose to use my pawns here, use my structure, because I've got 4 pawns on the queen side, and white only has 3 pawns on the queen side. So I'm going to try and get the majority running up the board, and see if I can get maybe a passed pawn, and perhaps decide the game that way. And it's going to be much harder for white to decide to roll his kingside pawns up, partly due to the fact I've got lots of pieces and my king on that side of the board. So I play b5. a3 is now played to stop b4 being played and chasing the knight away. And there's an option here. I could play b4, sort of forcing an exchange of pawns, and then I've got rid of my double pawns. But the downside is that the a file is now very good for his rook, and my rook on b8 is a bit underutilized, because the b file isn't really a very good place to be right now for black. The a file or even the e file would be much more would be a preferable position for the rooks. So instead, there's an idea of that I've actually shown you before if you've seen my previous videos. What do you think I did after a3? Yes, I improved the quality of my pieces and played knight b6. So a point of b5 is also to leave b6 open for the knight. And a3 it strengthened the dark squares on the queen side, but it weakened the light squares. So my knight can now control the light squares on the queen side, and perhaps even infiltrate white's half of the board very soon. So after f4, there's a bit of a cheapo here with f5 being threatened. The computer gives knight c4 immediately, and after f5, bishop h7, it says that black is clearly better because the knight on c4 has quite a good influence, and it views the queen side control as being more important than the bishop on h7 being locked up. But here I disagree with the computer, actually. I think that after b4, white is fine. He's locked down the queen side, at least temporarily. And the bishop on h7 is going to be useless for quite a long time. If I try and break out with f6, he'll play g6, and then there'll be nowhere to go for my bishop for a very long time, stuck on g8, which will also trap the rook on h8 as well. And if I play g6, he can play f6, and then I can never move any of my pawns, and my bishop on h7 will be stuck for as long as the pawns on h4, g5, f6 are still around. So I really didn't like this position. And again, I've made a video on this, so I'm not going to harp on about it too much. But again, I don't think the computer appreciates the long-term positional aspects of the game. It prefers tactical pressure, like knight c4. So I chose bishop e4 here to get out of being entombed on h7. And I wasn't too worried after he played knight takes, d takes. So I've taken away a square from his knight on g1. And although he can win this pawn on e4, I can threaten something in turn with knight c4. And here it's quite a tricky position to play, because if white wants to try and win a pawn and not lose anything on the queen side, he's going to have to play rook b1. And then if bishop takes e4, I would have knight d2, forking rook and bishop. And rook a2, protecting the pawn the other way, is just going to leave the rook immobile for a very long time. And I can castle kingside or play king d8. And then after bishop takes pawn, I have rook e8, and his bishop will have to move, and then the e3 pawn will be available for capture by my knight, as it will be protected by the rook on e8. So white isn't really winning a pawn in any of these calculated sequences. So a4 was played, which I don't like. I take, rook takes, and I now win a pawn. And I'm perfectly happy for white to have the a file if I'm a pawn up. I'm quite materialistic sometimes. And my knight on b2, even though uh, classically the corner and the fianchetto square for the bishops on b7, b2, g2, g7 have always been sort of noted for being very bad for knights because there aren't many squares they can head to. Here it's really useful because of the king on f2. So after rook a2, knight d1 check, forking king and pawn. And can anyone see what happens after king e2? Yeah, knight c3 winning the rook. So king g3 was having to be played. And here I didn't take immediately. I instead set a trap for white. Now, I'll give you 10 seconds. Can anyone see a way of setting a trap for white and what the trap is? Yes, I can win. I can win a bishop here for a few pawns with g6, and if bishop takes e4, knight c3 forks the rook and bishop. So here he played rook a1, and I actually thought my knight would be better than his bishop because the position might be quite closed up. So I kept my knight and exchanged e pawns. Then again, there's not really much reason to castle because this is now approaching the endgame. So I played king d7, knight f3 was played, and I can see knight e5 is inevitable, so I don't really prevent it very much. I play rook a8 to challenge white's rook, knight e5, and his knight is going to be very strong on e5, so I'll just take it. Now, which way would you capture if you were white in this position? Well, again, I think this is one of the cases where capturing towards the centre is stronger because d takes does keep the pawn structure fairly good here, as there's only one pawn island and there's a majority on the king side. But a much bigger factor would be that I'd have two connected passed pawns on the B and C files, so I could just throw them up the board and win quite easily. So f takes only allows me one passed pawn, and capturing towards the centre, it does control some of the centre. So I now activate my king with e6, king e6. And here, I don't think he should swap off into an endgame because I'm a pawn up, and I think my knight is better than his bishop, and his pawns are a bit weak. But he takes off the rooks, and then plays rook b1. I then activate the rook by threatening discovered checks all over the place. Rook takes b7, so temporarily equal on material. Knight f5 check. And I was surprised when he decided to activate the king instead of retreating it. I actually had thought he would play king f2 here, but perhaps his move was better. King f4, knight takes d4. So I'm simultaneously defending c6 and I've retained my pawn ahead. Now, a move I briefly had looked at a few moves earlier when I hadn't reached this position was rook c7, going after the c6 pawn. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll have to play rook c3, and then maybe he could try and draw by keeping pressure on me. But that's actually not a great idea. Why is rook c7 not a good move? Well, hopefully you're awake, because rook c7, and then knight e2 checkmate. Very, very nice checkmate. So he didn't play that. He played bishop g2. And again, I was very, very tired, so I couldn't really figure out a way of going after him very effectively. And I saw that if I wasn't careful, perhaps bishop h3 could be rather annoying. So knight e2, check. King e4 is forced. Knight c3 check. King d4. Knight b5 check. King c5. Rook c3 check. King b4. And here, my knight has sort of gone all the way from the centre to the other side of the board, and I didn't really know what I was doing here. So I played rook g3, bishop takes c6, so again we're equal on material, and knight d4 was played. So my idea here is that if his bishop moves away to e4, let's say, I could play rook b3, check, and swap off the rooks. And here I could then take on e5 with my king, and being a pawn up and with all the pawns on the same side of the board, my knight will clearly be better than his bishop, because knights like positions where all the activity is in one area. And his pawns are very hard to defend because his bishop is not able to protect them because they're on different coloured squares. So I felt reasonably confident I could win this. But he plays bishop a4, best move I think, stopping me swapping. King takes e5 is played, and rook e7 check. I wasn't too worried about rook takes f7 because it's a backward pawn, and I felt I could win the pawns before he could win mine. So I play knight e6, rook takes f7 is played, rook g4 check, king a3. Maybe not the best move. He should try and get his king over to the other side of the board. What's the king going to be doing on a3? Just waiting to be checkmated eventually. Rook takes h4, bishop c2. And I want to defend the pawn for a little while because he could always sacrifice his bishop for a couple of pawns, and I might be left with just a minor piece left at the end. And as you know, you can't checkmate with just a minor piece. So I defend with knight f4, rook e7 check, king d6, rook a7. And here I play rook g4. Now, why did white here, after rook a6, king e5, why did white not take on g6? Well, because I can win this endgame, actually, because his king, as I've said, is so far away. Knight takes, rook takes, so rook and pawn endgame time. King f5. I assume rook c6, just move the rook away. He can't defend g5. Rook takes. Check. King g4. And here I can just run the pawn up. This should be a very easy win. For example, just very simply get the pawn up, then cut off his king, keep it on the queen side of the board, don't let it come too close. And here I felt that I didn't need to calculate all this stuff out because the king and pawn should be able to overpower the rook as long as my rook can interpose in one of the checks. So, for example, rook g4. And his king, again, is way too far away to make any difference. And then this is just a trivial win. So he did not play that move. He did not play bishop takes g6. Instead, he wanted to keep the pieces on, and I think he wanted to try and perhaps swap off rooks, maybe, and then if his king could somehow make it to the king side, he could possibly draw by sacrificing his bishop for the 2 pawns. I think that was his vague hope. So instead he played rook a5 check, and I activated my king more with king d4. King b4 was now played. So he tries to activate his king, but in doing so, can anyone see how I win the pawn on g5? Yeah, knight d5 check. King moves. Rook takes g5. And here he tries to win the pawn on g6, and I can just check and move the pawn. Only a few more moves to the game. Bishop g6, rook g2, king moves, h4, rook d6, and I don't want to complicate things by playing h3, and then he pins my knight, he attacks the pinned knight and wins a piece, and all this stuff. I just want to win this and go home. So I play king e5, the rook moves, now h3. Nothing to worry about. No need to calculate. Just throw the pawn up, and in the next few moves I should be able to promote the pawn. So he did resign here at move 50, at the end, after my 56th move. So that was my game. Just to quickly view it from the beginning. So when you've got a position that you're unfamiliar with, such as this one, you can often rely on plans that you have seen many times. So in this position, I had thought the plan was just to clamp down on e4, and after c4, I thought this could look like a Slav, so I went for the Slav. What I didn't do, which a lot of chess players should do, and they don't, is adapt your plans move by move. That is one of the strengths of the computer. It's not biased in terms of what it's been thinking about last move or in the last few moves. And I felt c6 was a mistake, just because this isn't really a Slav. It's a kind of transposition to something that looks vaguely like a Slav. And I didn't realize that after my moves, I should again play e6 just to keep myself in familiar waters, and I might just be okay. After queen b3, I'm entering into a position I don't want. I don't want to trade queens, but I have to, and even though I may not have lost the game, and I may not be worse as black, I felt that if white knew me quite well, if the Mark knew me quite well, he probably would have just taken queens and left me with doubled isolated pawns. And I would have been very annoyed at myself and had to have played a position I wouldn't know that well. And even though I know the plans, it's not a position I've had very much, and I could easily go wrong. But then e6 did allow me to sort of find myself on familiar territory, and here it's not such a bad position. And I felt that, yeah, I had to adapt my plans move by move, and I did start to do that in terms of after bishop takes b8 and g5. Here, I then sort of knew what to do, because I've had this sort of position a few times, and again, yeah, the idea is just to make yourself felt, your presence felt on the queen side, and perhaps infiltrate with your knight. And here on d7, my knight's doing nothing, so after improving improving the worst piece, which was my bishop on f8, I then start to improve the second worst piece, the knight on d7. Then improve my bishop, which was about to become the very worst piece. And then improve my knight. And here my bishop and knight seem to be doing a fairly okay job. They're both pressurizing the queen side. My rooks have not yet been very useful, but neither of his. And over the next few moves, after I've used my knight and bishop to win a pawn, I then improve the king and then improve the rooks. So it's quite a sort of simple idea. Again, I was quite tired. I didn't have time to go for anything too intricate, but I have now improved all my pieces. And then we get to the tricky sort of end game, where I had to try and make all the activity be on one side of the board. So my knight would be better than the bishop, because at this moment there's two areas of activity, and my knight can't cover both simultaneously. So I then stop all the pawn activity on the queen side, and now here I knew I was going to win, because my knight's better and I'm a pawn up, and his pawns are very hard to defend. Mine are relatively easy to defend. So anyway, that was my game with Mark Murrell, and the lesson was on planning. I hope you got something from this video, and comment, like, subscribe. Any questions, leave them for me. So I'll see you in the next video.